Hey, we're going to do the digestive system in A&P today, tonight. When we start with the digestive system, I'd like you guys to know the overall functions of them. Again, just like our normal labs, guys, I'm going to take out all the aspects we actually measure something and just cover basically the structures or the anatomy and then the functions of those different parts, which is the physiology. But you guys know from my labs, we had a quiz every time. So expect like there would be a quiz because when I ask on the final exam, when I'm doing our final, I'm going to ask you some lecture concepts, but I'm also going to ask you some lab questions. And that combined is going to be your final grade in A&P. Now, the digestive system, what is its overall function? First of all, it is our body's way of physically or mechanically and chemically breaking down fuel molecules throughout the system so that we can absorb nutrients such as our carbs, such as our proteins, our lipids. Even the genetic material can be broken down by enzymes and utilized in our bodies at the cell level. So, when we think about the digestive system, think of it like this. It's our body's processing of the materials, food and liquids that we put into the system, obtaining the materials we need to carry out our chemistry or our metabolism. Not only do we get nutrients for making our ATP from our nutrient molecules, but we're also obtaining vitamins, minerals, on all these other aspects which are necessary to be able to perform these chemical pathways at the cellular level with digestion. So the digestive system, a very complex system, very well innervated. Whenever we're feeling comfortable in our digestive system, we feel pretty good overall. So it does have a major impact on our overall well-being, even of our nervous system. The digestive system, when we start, of course, the materials start by putting the food or the liquid into the oral cavity. We break the digestive system into two general categories. The first general category we call the GI tract. Now, the GI tract is known as the gastrointestinal tract. This is basically the tube that runs throughout our body. So when we think about the food and the drink or the liquids that pass through the digestive system, if it runs through this organ or this tube system, it's part of the GI tract. If it contributes to digestion, but the food or liquid does not pass through that particular structure or organ, we call those our accessory structures. And the accessory structures have a fundamental important aspect in the digestive system, but the food material doesn't go through it, so they're making contributions. For example, if we start with the beginning of the GI tract, the oral cavity or the mouth, there is several different structures that are involved with this structure that the food doesn't pass through. So we have like the teeth, we have tongue, we have lips, cheeks, all these different things, salivary glands. All these structures, the food or liquid does not pass through. So we consider them accessory in nature as opposed to in the intestinal tract. Now, teeth, we have a variety of forms of teeth, each having different functions. The front teeth that are flat like knives, we call incisors. We have sharp, pointy, rounded canines that are very good for tearing, whereas incisors are good for cutting and shearing off the material that we're taking in the bite or tearing the food material that's going in. So they're really the beginning here of the mechanical digestion of the food. So they're going to start tearing this into smaller and smaller pieces. Then we have these cusp teeth that are good for grinding and crushing the food materials with our molars. The tongue manipulates the food material around, helps form a swallowable size structure that we call a bolus. Bolus is simply the food material after we have masticated or chewed up that material. So to masticate means it's a fancy way of saying to chew, which obviously I like that word just because it does sound dirty. But masticate, as we chew our food, we're softening it, moistening it. We're having contributions from the saliva, from the salivary glands. Saliva is primarily water, 97 to 99% water. But it contains a lot of other materials, from mucus to proteins to enzymes. Enzymes like amylase. Amylase is one of the major enzymes that breaks down our carbs. And that begins right in the mouth or the oral cavity with the salivary glands. So amylase begins to break down these complex sugars into smaller and smaller, more simple sugars. And it's these simpler sugars then that are small enough molecules that can be absorbed across the GI tract when we get to the really well vascularized part, which is not until we get to the small intestine. We have 3 sets of salivary glands. I'd like you to know those 3 sets. We have parotid, we have the submandibular, and we have the sublingual. Now it's these pairs of salivary glands that you can see here on the model. If you look right here above the masseter muscle, right in front of the ear, anterior to the ear, you will see the parotids. And we have those on each side of the skull, of the face. If you look under here, you can see right under there's the mandible here. Right here, I'm touching the submandible. Sorry, broken arm.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Kind of freaked my daughter out there as she's watching me film here, or she's filming me. I'll break the guy's arm off. I know my students have seen this. They've seen me break shit 1,000 times. So you guys are just used to me tearing the hell out of the models. But anyway, there below the mandible is your submandibular. Now, we can't see the sublingual in this model, but below your tongue, if you open your mouth and raise your tongue up on each side of the frenulum, you get the sublingual, the duct from the sublingual. So here, these 3 glands basically contribute the salivary action of our mouth, which even precedes a lot of times, as soon as we smell food or think of food, our sensory or our nervous system's reaction to the preparation of food or liquid material usually gets us firing up the system. But my example was, here is the passage that the food goes through. We have all these accessory structures that make contributions, but the food doesn't pass through them as individual structures. So that is our first set here. Now, as we go from the oral cavity, we then form this bolus, which the bolus is a swallowable size, and we have a fancy word that we call deglution. Deglution is basically the fancy name for swallowing. So this is even a complex process of how the bolus is formed, pushed against the soft palate, back of the oropharynx. Now, the next major structure as we begin swallowing, or deglution, is the pharynx. And the pharynx is basically the fancy name for the throat. The throat, and we give this region a separate name because there is a distinct difference by the time we get down to the esophagus, which is the next part. But the pharynx also connects the trachea from the respiratory system up to the oral cavity and the nasal cavity. So it's this mutual connected tube we call the pharynx. Now the esophagus, we have a long tube here that passes down. Now you can't see it in this model very good because it has all the muscle here in the way and even the trachea. But if we move this tag there, you can see this blue and white striped looking thing with the coracoid rings as our trachea branching out to the main bronchi. But coming out from right behind that is our esophagus. And the esophagus, which the heart has been removed here and a portion of the lobes of the lungs have been removed. But the esophagus runs right behind the heart and then comes down here and then connects to the stomach if I move the liver out of the way. And you can see as it passes out of the thoracic cavity into the abdominal cavity, it passes through this muscle that we call the diaphragm. Very, very important muscle we covered when we hit the respiratory system. But the esophagus, it is unique in that it has a type of muscle contraction that we refer to as peristalsis or a peristaltic contraction. It works like this. The GI tract, the entire GI tract, except one structure, which is the stomach. The stomach has 3 layers of muscles. All the rest of the GI tract has 2 layers of muscle. Now this smooth muscle that forms these 2 layers, we have some that run with the tube, this direction, that we refer to as the longitudinal muscle. But then we have muscle that goes around the tube, the circumference of the tube, that we call circular muscles. So it's this rhythmic contraction of the esophagus utilizing these 2, the longitudinal and the circular muscles, that creates this rhythmic pushing of the food material or the bolus down the esophagus to the stomach, which usually, depending on the material and how well we masticated it, how well it's softened and lubricated, what the food material type is. Like a dry chip, it'll sometimes take a little longer to get down and you'll feel that hang up. But it ranges usually from about 2 to 8 seconds from the time we swallow till it hits the stomach. Now, the esophagus has up at the top of it a sphincter muscle. The circular muscles act like a sphincter, and so we refer to that as the upper esophageal sphincter. It's actually a physiological structure, but not an anatomical structure. Which if you want all the details of what the difference is, read in your textbook. But the lower esophageal sphincter is an anatomical structure. And so it's this lower esophageal sphincter that is capable of relaxing and allowing food materials to come back up. In other words, luckily for us humans, we have the ability to regurgitate or vomit. Otherwise, when we swallow poisons or toxins, it's doomed to go through us like it is in rodents. Rodents have a very efficient lower esophageal sphincter, so it makes it difficult, well, impossible for them to regurgitate those materials. But we humans sometimes have too leaky a one, and if it's too leaky, that lower esophageal, when we eat a really large meal and swell up our stomach, and especially if we go lay down in a recliner chair, a lot of the food materials will begin to come back up the esophagus. Now the stomach's equipped for the really acidic conditions in there, but the esophagus only has a thin mucus layer lining the inside of the esophagus. So when that acid hits that esophagus, it can erode that mucus layer and cause inflammation of the tissue, and of course leading to an esophageal ulcer. Is that time? Okay.